He thought he could attack a defenseless woman with impunity, but suddenly, Chuck Norris appeared. What happened next amazed everyone. Subscribe and let us know in the comments. What city are you watching from? The city was alive with the rhythmic chaos of the evening rush. Neon lights flickered against wet pavement, reflecting a spectrum of colors that danced between passing cars. The distant hum of traffic merged with the occasional honk of a horn, a siren wailing somewhere far off in the labyrinth of buildings. Pedestrians weaved through one another, some in a hurry, others lost in the glow of their phone screens. Among them, moving slower than the rest, was Sophia. Her hand rested protectively on the curve of her stomach as she walked, each step careful and deliberate. The weight of exhaustion pressed on her shoulders, her body sluggish from the long day. She had left work later than usual and now found herself alone, threading through the thinning crowd toward the bus stop. Despite the noise and movement around her, something unsettled her. A creeping sensation prickled at the back of her neck, a feeling of being watched. She cast a quick glance over her shoulder, but the street behind her looked normal. People passed in their usual hurry, the city swallowing them as they disappeared into doorways and subway entrances. Still, the feeling didn't leave. She took a deep breath and continued walking, but the awareness of something wrong grew stronger. It was subtle at first. Footsteps, slightly out of sync with the rest of the city's rhythm. They weren't hurried like those of a late commuter, nor aimless like a casual stroller. These steps followed a deliberate pace. Her pulse quickened. Maybe it was paranoia, a trick of the mind brought on by fatigue, but her instinct screamed otherwise. She reached a crosswalk and hesitated, letting a group of pedestrians pass in front of her. As they moved by, she turned her head slightly, scanning the street in her periphery. That's when she saw him. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the kind of controlled arrogance that made her stomach tighten. His uniform was unmistakable, the dark blue of the city police, his badge catching the glow of the streetlights. The name tag read Barrett. Sophia's breath hitched. She didn't know him personally, but she knew his reputation. Everyone in this part of the city did. Officer Barrett was the kind of cop people spoke about in hushed voices. His name surfaced in rumors, whispers of unnecessary force, of people stopped without reason, of bruises left unseen beneath sleeves and collars. But nothing ever stuck. He was the law, and the law didn't answer to shadows. And now he was following her. She forced herself to keep walking, her heartbeat hammering in her chest. Maybe it was a coincidence, maybe he was just heading in the same direction, but her body knew better. Ahead she saw an alley, narrow, dark, leading to a side street that would get her to the bus stop faster. It was risky, but she was running out of options. If he was truly following her, it was better to confirm it now rather than later when she was completely alone. She made a sharp turn into the alley, her footsteps echoing against the brick walls. The smell of damp concrete and distant garbage filled the air. A single flickering street lamp cast long, jagged shadows against the pavement. Silence. She exhaled shakily. Maybe she had been wrong, maybe. The heavy crunch of a boot against the ground shattered the quiet. She spun around. There he was. Officer Barrett stood at the mouth of the alley, his presence blocking any escape back to the main street. The dim lighting cast sharp angles over his face, making his features look even harder, crueler. His mouth twisted into something between a smirk and a sneer. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't random. He had been waiting for a moment like this. Her body screamed at her to run, but before she could react, he was moving. A single heavy stride closed the distance between them. His hand shot out, fingers clamping down on her shoulder with bruising force. Sophia gasped, her knees nearly buckling under the weight of his grip. Then he shoved her. It wasn't just a push, it was a statement, a reminder of his strength, of his control. The force sent her stumbling backward, and before she could catch herself, her foot caught on uneven pavement. She fell hard. The impact jolted through her body, her hands instinctively flying to protect her stomach as she hit the cold ground. A sharp pain shot through her elbow, but it was nothing compared to the panic gripping her chest. She could taste blood. Her lip must have split when she hit the pavement, the coppery tang mixed with the growing nausea in her stomach. The world spun for a moment, her vision swimming with the dull glow of the street lamp overhead. Above her, Barrett loomed, his shadow stretched over her like a predator's. His posture was relaxed, as if he had all the time in the world. He didn't look worried. He didn't look nervous. If anything, he looked amused. Sophia tried to scramble backward, but her body refused to move properly. She had never felt so vulnerable, so utterly powerless. Somewhere beyond the alley, life continued as if nothing was happening. The city kept moving, oblivious. No one was coming to help her. No one was going to stop him, and Sullivan knew it. But then, the rhythm of the city shifted, a presence, a force, a shadow darker than the alley itself. Chuck Norris had arrived. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, a rapid drum of warning. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe he was just heading the same way, but her body knew better. Ahead, she saw an alley. Narrow, dark, leading to a side street that would get her to the bus stop faster. It was risky, but she was running out of options. If he was truly following her, it was better to confirm it now rather than later when she was completely alone. She made a sharp turn into the alley, her footsteps echoing against the brick walls. The smell of damp concrete and distant garbage filled the air. A single flickering street lamp cast long, jagged shadows against the pavement. Silence. She exhaled shakily. Maybe she had been wrong. Then the heavy crunch of a boot against the ground shattered the quiet. She spun around, and there he was. Officer Barrett stood at the mouth of the alley, his presence blocking any escape back to the main street. The dim lighting cast sharp angles over his face, making his features look even harder, crueler. His mouth twisted into something between a smirk and a sneer. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't random. He had been waiting for a moment like this. Her body screamed at her to run, but before she could react, he was moving. A single heavy stride closed the distance between them. His hand shot out, fingers clamping down on her shoulder with bruising force. Sophia gasped, her knees nearly buckling under the weight of his grip. Then he shoved her. It wasn't just a push, it was a statement, a reminder of his strength, of his control. The force sent her stumbling backward, and before she could catch herself, her foot caught on uneven pavement. She fell hard. The impact jolted through her body, her hands instinctively flying to protect her stomach as she hit the cold ground. A sharp pain shot through her elbow, but it was nothing compared to the panic gripping her chest. She could taste blood. Her lip must have split when she hit the pavement, the coppery tang mixed with the growing nausea in her stomach. The world spun for a moment, her vision swimming with the dull glow of the street lamp overhead. Above her, Barrett loomed, his shadow stretched over her like a predator's. His posture was relaxed, as if he had all the time in the world. He didn't look worried. He didn't look nervous. If anything, he looked amused. Sophia tried to scramble backward, but her body refused to move properly. She had never felt so vulnerable, so utterly powerless. Somewhere beyond the alley, life continued as if nothing was happening. The city kept moving, oblivious. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps. The panic set in fully now, drowning her thoughts. No one was coming to help her. No one was going to stop him, and Barrett knew it. Pain radiated through Sophia's body as she struggled to regain control of her breath. The impact of the fall had left her momentarily stunned, her limbs heavy, her thoughts sluggish. Her hands still clutched her stomach, a desperate, instinctive attempt to protect the life growing inside her. But as she looked up at the looming figure before her, she knew this had nothing to do with her pregnancy. This was about something else entirely. Barrett didn't move immediately. He just stood there, watching her. With slow, measured amusement, the way a cat watches a mouse after it has already decided the outcome. Sophia's pulse thundered in her ears. She knew how these stories ended. She had read the headlines, heard the testimonies whispered in community meetings. She knew the type of man Officer Barrett was. Not just a bully, not just an abuser of power, but something worse. A predator. One who hid behind a badge, who knew that people feared him too much to fight back. And here, in this darkened alleyway, away from the crowd, he had her exactly where he wanted. She forced herself to move, pushing up onto one elbow, her other hand still pressed protectively over her stomach. Barrett's boot shifted just slightly. A warning. She froze. His hand hovered near his belt, fingers tapping lazily against the handle of his baton. The movement was casual, almost distracted, but she wasn't naive enough to mistake it for anything less than deliberate. This was a game to him. Her fingers scraped against the rough concrete as she tried to push herself up further. Her elbow throbbed where she had landed on it, a dull, spreading ache. The silence around them was suffocating. Beyond the alley, the city still moved. Cars honked, voices laughed. The distant rhythm of life continued as if nothing was happening. But here, in this narrow stretch of darkness, time had slowed. Sophia's breathing was shallow, erratic. She willed herself to think, to do something, anything. But the fear sat like a weight on her chest. She glanced toward the mouth of the alley. The street beyond wasn't far. If she could just get to her feet. Barrett sighed, tilting his head slightly as if reading her thoughts. Then, without warning, he moved. A single step forward. The shift in power was instantaneous. He wasn't just standing over her now. He was above her, closer, his presence crushing. Sophia's muscles locked. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run. But her body refused to cooperate, paralyzed by the sharp, electric current of terror running through her veins. Barrett crouched slightly, resting his hands on his knees as he studied her. His expression was unreadable, but the gleam in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. He enjoyed this. She had heard stories about him before, tales of people, mostly women, who had been cornered, threatened, humiliated. But those stories had always seemed distant, like something that happened to other people. Now she was living one. And just like in those stories, she could already see the ending. A flicker of movement caught her eye. A man walking past the alley. His gaze briefly flicked in their direction. Sophia's heart leapt. She opened her mouth, desperate to call out, but before she could, Barrett shifted his weight and his hand dropped to his baton. He didn't even have to draw it. The simple motion, the unspoken "don't even try," was enough to make the passerby hesitate. Just for a second, and that was all it took. The man turned his head away, kept walking. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She watched the figure retreat, his silhouette swallowed by the bustling street beyond. She wanted to scream after him, to beg for help, but the words wouldn't come. And even if they did, she knew they would be ignored. Because that was how it always happened. People saw. They always saw. But they never interfered. Because this was how it always happened. People saw. They always saw. But they never interfered. Fear was a disease in this city. It spread through the streets, seeped into the cracks of sidewalks, nestled in the walls of apartment buildings. It lived in the whispered warnings exchanged between neighbors and the unspoken understanding that some fights weren't worth getting involved in. And men like Officer Barrett thrived in that silence. His baton tapped against his palm now, a slow, rhythmic beat against the thick leather of his gloves. He was waiting. For what, Sophia didn't know. Maybe for her to make the next move. Maybe just to watch her squirm. Her fingers curled into fists against the pavement. Her body screamed at her to do something. But what could she do? He was bigger, stronger, armed. And her? She was alone. The fear in her chest twisted into something colder. A slow, creeping realization. This wasn't just about him wanting to hurt her. This was about power, and right now he had all of it. Her breath hitched in her throat as he took another step forward, the rubber sole of his boot scraping against the pavement. No one was coming. No one was going to stop him. And he knew it. The city had no eyes. It moved, breathed, lived. But it did not save. It did not care. People passed by on the sidewalk outside the alley, their faces illuminated by the glow of streetlights and neon signs. They laughed, talked, checked their phones, never once turning to acknowledge the darkened space between the buildings where a woman lay on the ground, trembling. Sophia was trapped in that blindness, in the cold, unfeeling void where only those who suffered could see clearly. And Barrett knew it. He stood over her, his baton tapping methodically against his gloved palm, a slow, menacing rhythm. There was no urgency in his posture, no fear of consequences. He had all the time in the world, and he wanted her to know it. Sophia tried to push herself up again, but her limbs felt sluggish, her body unresponsive. The shock of the fall had rattled her, and fear did the rest. She had never felt so utterly helpless. She had no weapon, no means to fight back. And even if she screamed, who would listen? Who would risk stepping in? Barrett shifted his weight, boots scraping against the concrete. He took a slow step forward, and the air seemed to grow heavier. The alley shrank around her. His shadow stretched long and jagged under the flickering street lamp, swallowing hers whole. Sophia's pulse pounded in her ears. She had to do something, anything. But as she tensed, forcing herself to move, something changed. A ripple in the air. A shift in the silence. The rhythm of the city stuttered. The tapping of the baton stopped. Barrett's head turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge what Sophia had already felt. A presence. At first it was unclear who. The street outside was still full of people, but none of them were looking. No one had stopped. And then she saw him. A man. Not just any man. A figure that seemed to materialize from the crowd, emerging from the sea of indifferent faces like something carved from stone. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed simply in dark jeans, a plain shirt, and a faded denim jacket. His presence wasn't loud, wasn't aggressive, but it was there, filling the space around him in a way that was impossible to ignore. His presence wasn't loud. Was it aggressive? But it was there, filling the space around him in a way that was impossible to ignore. His posture was relaxed, but there was nothing casual about it. His steps were measured, deliberate, the kind of walk that did not belong to a man uncertain of his place in the world. He didn't belong to the blind city. He had eyes, and he had seen. Sophia could barely process the shift in the air as he crossed the street, stepping onto the sidewalk without hurry, without hesitation. He didn't weave through the crowd. The crowd moved for him. Even those who weren't looking at him seemed to sense something, an unspoken command in his presence. The gap between him and the rest of the world widened with each step. Officer Barrett turned fully now, his shoulders squaring as he studied the approaching man, the baton in his hand stilled, fingers tightening around the handle. He knew, just as Sophia did, that this man was different. Not a bystander. Not a witness. A force. And he was coming straight for them. Barrett shifted his stance slightly, adjusting his grip on the baton, his expression flickering between irritation and something else. Caution. Sophia's breath came in shallow, uneven gasps. She couldn't tell if this man was here to help her or if he was just another piece in a game she didn't understand. But something in the way he moved told her this was not a man who ignored things. He reached the entrance of the alley and stopped for a moment. The world seemed to hold its breath. The neon glow from the street barely touched his face, but his eyes, dark, unreadable, were fixed on Barrett. No words were spoken. None were needed. The shift in power was instant. Sophia felt it before Barrett did. The way the space around them changed. The way the very weight of the air adjusted itself. It was the unspoken law of predators, the moment when one recognized another. Barrett's jaw tightened. He wasn't afraid. Not yet. But he was aware. And that was something. The man in the denim jacket took another step forward, closing the last bit of space between them. He didn't break eye contact. Didn't flinch. Barrett inhaled through his nose, slow and measured. He was calculating. Could he get away with this? Could he still win? Sophia saw the answer in his stance. He wasn't backing down. But neither was the man who had come for him. Something told her this was about to end very, very differently than Barrett had planned. The alley was silent, but not empty. The city still breathed beyond it, the rhythm of life undisturbed by the moment unfolding in its shadows. A car horn blared somewhere in the distance, followed by the distant chatter of pedestrians spilling out of a bar. But here, in this narrow corridor between buildings, time had stretched, thickened, wrapped itself around the two men standing at its center. Sophia felt like an observer in her own nightmare, watching as the stranger and Barrett faced each other in the dim light. She had never seen a man like this before. Someone who could step into a space and shift the balance of power with nothing more than his presence. He hadn't spoken a word, yet Barrett had already squared his shoulders, muscles tensing beneath his uniform. The baton in his hand, once tapping with casual arrogance, was now still. His fingers curled tighter around it, knuckles whitening as he measured the situation. Sophia could almost hear the calculations running through his mind. The way his gaze flicked over the stranger's frame, taking in his size, his stance, the way he carried himself. The man in the denim jacket remained motionless. But there was nothing passive about him. His posture was loose, his weight balanced, every muscle primed for movement. He was waiting, not with hesitation, but with patience. The kind of patience that belonged to someone who had been in situations like this before. Someone who had seen men like Barrett, and had already decided exactly how this would end. Here's the rewritten version with a coherent flow, proper punctuation, and formatting while maintaining the original meaning and making it consistent with American culture. The stranger had been in situations like this before. He had seen men like Barrett, men who believed power made them invincible, and he had already decided exactly how this would end. For the first time since the encounter began, a flicker of unease crossed Officer Barrett's face. It was brief, quickly buried beneath years of arrogance and unchecked authority, but Sophia saw it, and so did the stranger. The moment stretched between them, heavy and silent. Barrett, unwilling to let control slip from his grasp, made his choice. He moved first. It happened fast. 1 second, the alley was thick with tension. The next, Barrett lunged forward, swinging his baton in a sharp downward arc. The air whistled with the force of the strike, a blow meant to shatter bone, if it connected. The projector plopped in a shower of plastic. Damn! It didn't. The stranger sidestepped at the last moment, his movement fluid, effortless, like he had anticipated the attack before it had even begun. The baton sliced through empty air, and in the fraction of a second it took Barrett to recover, the counterstrike came. A fist drove into Barrett's solar plexus with precise, unrelenting force. The impact was brutal. A hollow, sickening sound followed as the air left Barrett's lungs in a sharp gasp. His body jerked, doubling over instinctively, his grip on the baton loosening for just a moment. But the stranger didn't stop there. A second blow followed, this one to the ribs. It was controlled, deliberate, not wild, not rushed. It landed with the precision of someone who knew exactly where to hit and how much force to use. Barrett staggered backward, his boots scuffing against the concrete, his face twisting in pain. Sophia barely breathed. She had seen fights before, street scuffles, drunken brawls outside clubs, but this was different. This wasn't a chaotic flurry of fists and rage. This was something calculated. The man in the denim jacket wasn't a man who fought for sport. He was a man who fought to end things. Barrett snarled, his pride wounded more than his body. He recovered fast. Too fast for someone who had just taken 2 direct blows. He was strong, that much was clear. He had spent years throwing his weight around, using his size and training to dominate those weaker than him. But for the first time, he wasn't the strongest one here. He adjusted his stance, gripping the baton in both hands now, realizing that underestimating this man had been a mistake. His next attack was more measured, more controlled. He swung low, aiming for the stranger's knee. A move designed to disable an opponent before they could retaliate. Again, it missed. This time, the stranger didn't just dodge. He stepped into the attack. His hand snapped out, catching Barrett's wrist mid-swing. A heartbeat later, he twisted. The motion was sharp and precise, a maneuver meant to disarm. Barrett grunted, his grip faltering as pain jolted up his arm. The baton clattered to the ground, skidding across the pavement. Sophia felt something shift in the air, something final. Barrett tried to yank his arm free, but the stranger held firm. A second later, he moved again, stepping in closer and using his own body weight to flip Barrett off balance. The officer hit the ground hard, his back slamming against the concrete, his breath leaving him in a stunned exhale. For a moment he lay there, chest rising and falling rapidly, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The stranger stepped over him, looking down with an expression that was unreadable. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't reveling in victory. He was simply done. Barrett groaned, rolling onto his side, his face contorted in pain and fury. His hand twitched toward his belt, toward the gun holstered there. A single sharp movement cut him off. The stranger's boot came down, not on his hand but beside it, firm enough to send a warning through the ground beneath them. Barrett froze. For the first time since the fight began, real fear flickered in his eyes. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement. Barrett froze. For the first time since this encounter began, real fear entered his eyes. Sophia exhaled shakily, the adrenaline making her limbs feel weak. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if Barrett would try again, if he would take the humiliation and twist it into something worse later. But she knew one thing. Tonight, for the first time, he had lost. And someone had finally made him feel powerless. The stranger stepped back, lifting his foot from where it had been planted near Barrett's hand. He didn't look at Sophia. He didn't say a word. He simply turned, his movements as unhurried as they had been when he arrived. He walked away, heading back toward the mouth of the alley, disappearing into the street beyond. The fight was over. But something told Sophia this was far from the end. The sound of Barrett's heavy breathing filled the alley, a jagged, uneven rasp as he lay sprawled on the ground. The fight had left him winded, stripped of the power he had carried so effortlessly just moments ago. His fingers twitched against the concrete, curling into a fist as if gripping at the last remnants of control. His pride was wounded, deeper than his body, and that was a pain he wasn't used to feeling. Sophia had not moved. She remained where she had fallen, watching as the scene before her shifted in a way she never could have anticipated. The stranger had stepped away from Barrett, his back turned, his silhouette a stark contrast against the faint glow of the street beyond the alley. He did not gloat. He did not taunt. He simply left, as if what had just transpired required no further action. And maybe, for him, it didn't. Barrett, however, was not done. A low growl of frustration rumbled from his chest as he pushed himself up, his limbs trembling slightly from the strain of the blows he had taken. His face twisted with fury, his jaw clenched so tightly that the veins in his neck stood out. He was not used to losing. He was not used to being on the receiving end of the kind of violence he so often inflicted. Sophia saw the moment his mind shifted, the moment survival turned into revenge. His hand moved toward his belt, fingers grazing the holster at his side. Even in his weakened state, even with the weight of defeat pressing down on him, he was still a man with a weapon. But the stranger had not left yet. The moment Barrett reached for his gun, the man in the denim jacket turned. His movement was unhurried, controlled, but his eyes, those dark, unreadable eyes, locked onto Barrett with an intensity that froze the officer in place. It wasn't fear that stopped him. It was the undeniable certainty that if he continued, this night would end very differently. If he continued, the consequences would be swift and absolute. Barrett's fingers hesitated just above his holster, trembling with indecision. His breath came fast and sharp, his rage battling against something more primal, an instinct that told him without question that he was no longer in control. The stranger took a single step forward. That was all it took. Barrett's hand dropped away from his belt, his lips curling in frustration. He wanted to fight back, to reclaim the dominance he had lost, but some part of him, some deep animalistic part, understood that it was over. There was no salvaging this. Not now. The stranger said nothing. He didn't have to. Sophia felt the weight of it in the air, the unspoken finality of the moment. She could see it in the way Barrett's shoulders slumped, just slightly, his pride warring with the reality of his position. He could push further, could force this into something worse, but he would not walk away from it unscathed. And Barrett was a man who had never truly known consequence. Until now. A murmur stirred at the entrance of the alley. The crowd that had once ignored the unfolding scene had begun to change. Eyes that had previously averted were now fixed on the aftermath, drawn by something undeniable. Phones were out, cameras recording, their screens glowing as they captured evidence that would not be buried. Sophia's heartbeat quickened. For the first time the city saw. Barrett must have felt it too. He turned his head slightly, his gaze darkening as he took in the figures gathering at the edges of the alley. Some stood in quiet disbelief, others murmured among themselves, but none of them moved to intervene. Not because they were afraid, because they had already chosen a side, and it was not his. A flicker of something passed through his eyes. Realization, perhaps, or the bitter taste of inevitability. Then came the sound. Distant at first, barely a murmur against the city's constant hum. Then it grew. Sharp, distinctive. Sirens. Barrett's expression darkened. His body tensed as he turned toward the street, toward the approaching blue and red lights reflecting off the wet pavement. The reality of what had just happened settled over him. And for the first time that night, he looked uncertain. Sophia could hardly believe it. He was going to be held accountable. The stranger remained still, watching, but making no move to stay. He had done what needed to be done. His presence had shifted the tides, tilting the balance away from men like Barrett and toward something closer to justice. But he had no intention of waiting to see how it ended. He turned again, this time with finality, and walked toward the mouth of the alley. His steps were as steady as they had been when he arrived, unaffected by the weight of what had just transpired. He was leaving. Barrett saw it too, and for a brief moment something desperate flickered in his expression. He wanted to call out, to demand something, but no words came. There was nothing left to say, nothing he could do to undo what had already been set in motion. The crowd parted as the stranger stepped onto the sidewalk, blending into the city as seamlessly as he had emerged from it. He was gone. Sophia barely had time to process it. Sophia barely had time to process what had happened before the police arrived. The cruisers skidded to a halt at the curb, their tires screeching against the wet pavement. Doors burst open as uniformed officers spilled into the street, radios crackling with static. Their hands hovered near their holsters, ready for anything. But what they found was not a riot, not chaos. They found one of their own. Barrett lay bloodied on the ground, his reputation shattered in the cold light of the street lamps. The scattered pieces of his authority lay around him, unseen but undeniable. One of the officers stepped forward, glancing between Barrett and the gathering crowd. Then his gaze landed on Sophia, who still sat against the wall. Shaken, but alive. What happened here? The words cut through the tense air, but no one answered immediately. Not because they didn't know, but because they wanted it to be said aloud. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, a voice rang out. It attacked her. Another followed, shoved her to the ground. The murmurs swelled, voices overlapping in a rising chorus. Each one was a witness, each one a thread in the unraveling of Barrett's carefully protected power. The officer's expression darkened. He turned toward Barrett, who had pushed himself upright but said nothing. There was nothing left for him to say. The evidence was overwhelming. The weight of the crowd was against him. "Check the security footage," the officer ordered one of his subordinates. "I want to see everything." Barrett flinched. He knew what they would find. There would be no rewriting this story, no twisting it into something that fit his version of events. Justice was not blind tonight. Sophia inhaled deeply, the cold night air sharpening her senses. She was safe. But more than that, for the first time in a long time, the city did not feel quite so indifferent. Because tonight someone had finally seen. The street was awash in flashing blue and red, the rhythmic pulse of sirens reflecting off the slick pavement like ghostly warnings. For a moment the hum of the city had faded into the background. But now it surged back to life. The murmuring voices, the crackle of police radios, the distant honking of impatient drivers forced to reroute. The air smelled of exhaust and damp concrete, mingling with the electric tension still hanging over the scene. Sophia sat on the curb, her body still trembling from the adrenaline that had yet to fade. She pressed a palm to her stomach, grounding herself, feeling the steady rise and fall of her breath. The crowd had grown since the fight ended, drawn in by the spectacle, by the presence of uniformed officers surrounding one of their own. Barrett was still on the ground, his hands pressed against his knees, his face contorted in pain and anger. His uniform was rumpled, his dignity shattered, his illusion of invincibility stripped away. Under the unblinking gaze of cameras and witnesses, he had been untouchable once. A name spoken in warning. A figure feared but never challenged. But tonight, the city had finally seen him fall. Sophia turned her head, searching for the man who had saved her. The man in the denim jacket. The stranger who had stepped into the darkness and pulled her back into the light. But he was gone. Not a trace of him remained. It was as if he had never been there at all. She wasn't the only one looking. Some in the crowd glanced around, their eyes darting through the shifting bodies, scanning the street, the alleys, the doorways. Even the officers cast quick glances toward the sidewalks, their brows furrowed, as if expecting to find him standing nearby, watching. But there was nothing. He had vanished into the city, swallowed by the very streets from which he had emerged. The realization left Sophia with a strange sense of emptiness, a hollow awareness that she had witnessed something rare, something fleeting. 3 days later, Church and NASA sat together in the freshly painted entrance hall at church meetings in Russia. The man who had fought for her, who had faced Barrett without fear, had not waited for thanks. He had not lingered for recognition. He had simply done what needed to be done, and then disappeared. He hadn't waited for recognition or validation. He had simply done what needed to be done, and then he was gone. A firm voice pulled Sophia from her thoughts. "Miss, are you all right?" She turned to find one of the officers crouched beside her, his expression serious but not unkind. His badge gleamed under the flashing lights, the reflection highlighting the hard lines of his face. Sophia opened her mouth to respond, but her throat was dry. Her voice was lost somewhere between exhaustion and disbelief. She swallowed, forcing herself to focus, to find her words. She exhaled slowly. "I think so." The officer nodded, his gaze lowering to where she cradled her stomach. His expression softened slightly. "We're going to have paramedics check you out, just to be safe." Sophia barely had the energy to nod. Her body was still locked in the remnants of fear, but she accepted his words without protest. Across the street, another officer stood with Barrett, speaking in clipped, hushed tones. It was clear that no amount of rank would protect him now. The weight of what had happened was too much, too public. The footage, the witnesses, the undeniable truth that had unfolded under the flickering glow of the street lamps. There was no room for manipulation. Barrett's career was over. And yet, even in his defeated state, Sophia saw the way his hands clenched, the way his jaw tightened, with barely restrained fury. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't ashamed. He was simply enraged that, for the first time, he had been stopped. Sophia turned away, unwilling to let him steal another second of her thoughts. The paramedics arrived, moving through the crowd with quiet efficiency. One of them, a woman with warm brown eyes and a steady voice, knelt beside Sophia and gently took her wrist, checking her pulse. "Do you feel any sharp pain?" she asked, her tone calm and professional. Sophia shook her head. "No, just shaken." The paramedic nodded in understanding, her hands moving to examine Sophia's elbow, where the worst of the impact had landed. A deep scrape, darkened with dirt and dried blood, marred her skin, but nothing appeared broken. "You're lucky," the paramedic said softly. "It could have been much worse." Sophia knew that. She had seen how close she had come to something far more terrible. The paramedic finished her assessment, giving her a reassuring nod. "We'll clean this up, but if you feel any dizziness or pain later, make sure you see a doctor. And if anything feels wrong with the baby, don't wait to get checked out." Sophia placed a hand over her stomach again, feeling the steady warmth beneath her fingertips. "I will," she promised. The crowd had begun to thin. The initial shock of the scene faded into the ordinary hum of the city. People had recorded what they needed. They had whispered about what they had seen. And now slowly they were moving on. But as they left, they carried something with them. A story. One they would tell again and again. A story about a cop who had abused his power and had finally faced justice. A story about a man who had appeared out of nowhere, fought without hesitation, and disappeared without a word. And that was how it would spread, not just as another piece of urban legend, but as something real. Reminder that even in the depths of the city, where corruption thrived and fear silenced those who wished to speak, there were still those who would not stand by, those who would act, those who would not wait for permission to do what was right. Sophia watched as Barrett was finally led toward one of the police cruisers. His face was pale, his rage barely contained, but there was nothing he could do. The weight of the night pressed down on him, on the choices he had made, on the consequences he had never thought he would face. She turned away before they closed the door behind him. The officer from before returned to her side. The officer's expression was unreadable. "Do you know who that man was?" Sophia hesitated. She didn't know his name. She had never seen him before tonight, and yet she felt certain that she had always known his kind. "No," she said finally, "but I don't think that matters." The officer studied her for a moment, then nodded. It was an answer that felt more truthful than any name could have been. As she was helped to her feet, she cast one last glance toward the street, half expecting to see him standing there, watching. But of course he wasn't. The night had swallowed him whole, just as it had done before, just as it would again. And somewhere in another part of the city, in another darkened alley, where someone else might be crying out for help, Chuck Norris was already moving toward the next fight. The lesson from this story is clear. Justice requires action, not silence. In a world where corruption thrives in the shadows, standing by and doing nothing only enables the abuse of power. Too often people witness wrongdoing and turn away, afraid or indifferent, believing it's not their fight. But the moment someone like Chuck Norris steps in, the balance shifts. Courage is contagious. It only takes one person to remind the world that justice is not just a concept, but a responsibility. Strength isn't about brute force. It's about using power to protect, not to oppress. Whether in small moments or grand gestures, we all have the ability to take a stand. Whether by speaking up, holding others accountable, or refusing to let fear dictate our actions. The world doesn't change by waiting for heroes. It changes when ordinary people choose to act. Be the one who refuses to look away. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more. Don't forget to check out our other videos for gripping content. Share this video with your friends, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from.